So, hi, Pavan.
Hi there.
A
Hello.
beautiful day today. The world is suffering a crisis. Corporations are desperately trying to figure out what to do in a crisis. There's an old saying, the Chinese word for a crisis is Wei Ji, which has two syllables. One of the first of which is translated as danger, and the second is often translated as opportunity. So we have a crisis that's both a danger and an opportunity. What is the opportunity that you think for the world at large and for corporations in particular?
Well, as you and your Chinese proverb points out, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And it would be really terrible if we did not learn from this crisis of the course that we've taken, the errors in that course, and the course correction that we need to make. I think recognizing the value of public goods is probably lesson number one. Public health services need to be good and they need to be invested. And markets are not going to deliver public health services. That's not how markets work. Markets basically trade private claims. When it comes to community goods and services, public goods and services, communities and the public, and in other words, government needs to provide them. And people need to collaborate in that, in the financing of that. So that's lesson number one. And I think lesson number two is that corporations have, well, 2/3 of the economy and jobs, and in the US it's 75%. Corporations are terribly important when it comes to addressing public issues because they have huge public impacts, and some of these are negative externalities, what we keep talking about. So it's really important for the corporation to continue with its mandate and its social license to operate, and indeed for its shareholders to be satisfied, to ensure that it recognizes all of these risks that are coming to us and learn how to manage these risks and learn how to respond when these risks hit the proverbial. So I think there's a lesson there as well.
But if you look at sort of different types of corporations, some are better prepared than others. I mean, what do you think are those corporations that are best placed to perhaps survive or even prosper in a crisis like the one we're seeing now?
Well, to be honest, with a crisis like this, if we look at the broad risks that we are facing, which is climate change, disruption to city living and disruption to logistics, or freshwater crisis, disruptions to agriculture and food systems, or health crisis, coronavirus, which is a disruption to human living, human health, and of course a disruption, indeed a complete collapse in transportation, in hospitality, in non-food retail. There are clearly certain sectors which respond more dramatically to certain crises, but we know what they are. I mean, none of this is rocket science, right? We can kind of figure this out. So the first thing to do is to have your overall risk analysis framework, which sectors, what crises, and like do your own red, orange, neutral, green signaling, and understand what's at risk in what context. So that's step one. Step two is to start preparing for that. Create resilience. Figure out what you would do in circumstances when the proverbial shit hits the fan.
Well, but in a post-COVID world, perhaps we should look a bit beyond this current crisis. We face a lot of other existential crises, obviously global warming and so on. What should corporations actually do to look at themselves and prepare themselves to perhaps cope with future crises and look at where they're going wrong as well as what they're doing right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing is measuring performance for a corporation. It's been traditionally accepted that all you need to measure is shareholder performance, profit and loss balance sheet, and publish it once a year based on IFRS, and you're fine. But clearly that's not enough, because that doesn't tell you how well you're prepared for these crises. And that doesn't tell you what your contribution to these crises is. If you're, let's say, a hotel chain which happens to be involved in the propagation of the virus, or if you happen to be an oil company involved in the propagation of climate change. So I think we need to look at measuring dependencies and measuring impacts, and therefore broaden the concept of what is a corporate performance to see what are a corporation's impacts beyond just the financial impacts on its shareholders. So that clearly is one side to it. That's impact measurement, and therefore presenting the integrated profit and loss, and not just a simple IFRS P&L. And the second side of it is dependencies, measuring your dependencies, doing the scenario analysis and seeing what gets disrupted if any of these big crisis areas are activated, as it seems to be happening more and more frequently as the climate breaks down and as human health follows.
And what should companies do, though, to manage that risk or to even work out whether there is a risk?
Well, two things, to be honest. I think one is doing a proper risk analysis. I think there's no running away from it, right? You just need to recognize that these risks are real. This is not about some greenies or social activists complaining about whatever. It's about reality that we have caused as a result of the impacts we've had and our economy has had on the environment and on society. So work out your big risk areas and list them down and actually discuss it as an executive strategy and a board level approval of accepting of the company's presence and engagement in that space. And the second is measure your impacts. How are you contributing to these crises? Because you really are. I mean, 2/3 of the economy or 3/4 in the US is private sector. So whatever impacts are happening, a large part of them is coming from the private sector. And therefore it is the behavior and the model, the business model of the private sector in its different sectors, different businesses, which is the cause of the problem. We need to fix that. And that's not going to happen simply by waiting for rules and regulations. I think, it might actually. As I keep saying, externalities do get internalized at some point, and it can happen by design, which is what we are talking about. It can happen by decree, which is, the second D of internalization, which is when government changes a rule or imposes a sugar tax or a sugar levy or an oil tax or a carbon tax or whatever. And the third is by disaster, the sort of situation of British Petroleum, BP, and its huge and tragic oil rig disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. CEO loses his job, company's market cap drops by 70 billion US, and so on and so on. So, there are different ways in which externalities get internalized. Externalities, at the end of the day, are basically tomorrow's risks, and tomorrow's risks are day after tomorrow's costs. So today's externalities need to be focused because actually they matter, not just to society, but also to you.
And what about investors? I mean, it's investors that are going to be facing a lot of these risks and through the companies they invest in. What should they be doing to try and encourage or force change by the corporates they invest in?
Well, absolutely. Investors and indeed lenders will be affected because at the end of the day, they are sitting across aggregates of assets, which include many of these risks that I talk about, many of the risk areas that we are facing, and the fact that companies are dependent on the free supply of clean air and an inclement climate and fresh water and so on. I think these things can change, and very dramatically. The ability to be mobile clearly has changed dramatically as a result of coronavirus. So I think investors need to also do a more broad-based risk analysis of their portfolios, and at the same time recognizing that socially responsible investment is increasing in size and activism. I think they need to also understand the impacts of their portfolios. Do they have impact portfolios which are negatively impacting the risk picture around the planet and causing grief? Or do they have portfolios which are relatively benign? In other words, instead of investing your socially responsible investment today, sadly, as you and I recognize, is very much thematic. It's all flavor of the month. Is it about vegetable meat or is it about solar cells or whatever it is? But this flavor of the month investing for social responsibility really isn't the way forward. I mean, there is a scientific approach that we need to follow. Look at the portfolio, see its impacts on the environment, on society, and on human health, and understand the externalities of the portfolio, measure them, and evaluate them, and then basically go for mixes which give you good return, but low social cost. I think that's the way forward.
When you say measurement, what's the metrics that need to be done or used in measurement?
Well, I mean, there's the integrated profit and loss approach, where you measure impacts on all four capitals, not just financial capital, but also human capital. That's the knowledge, skills, and health of your employees and how that changes. Also natural capital, that's the natural world around us in terms of its availabilities, and many of these are still available free. And then there's social capital, which is the social fabric, the relationships, the trust, and the formal institutions in society that need to be valued because they are essential towards a good business's survival. So if you measure in four capital terms, not just produced, in other words, financial and manufactured capital, but also in terms of human, natural, and social capital, then you're doing the right thing. You're covering total impacts. You need to know your total impacts. You need to manage your total impacts.
Well, thanks, Pavan. I mean, for our viewers, maybe they agree with the Chinese word for crisis, that it's both a danger and opportunity. Maybe some of you could write down what you think are the opportunities to make best use of this crisis, to perhaps prepare the world and themselves for the next crisis that's going to come, which one thing we can be certain of, something else will happen during our lifetimes, I suspect.
Yeah, I'd take a bet on any amount of money that is almost certain. But let's prepare. Thank you.
Thank you.